Hey everyone, welcome to Thinking Christian, and in this video what I'm going to do is talk about William Lane Craig's version of the moral argument for the existence of God. Now there are many types of moral arguments, and I don't know if Craig would be happy with me attaching his name to this one, but he's the one that I most often see using this, and I think most people do cite his name when they use it in this particular formulation, so that's why I'm attributing his name to it, even though these moral arguments have been around for a very, very long time. I also want to say I'm not here to necessarily defend the argument. As usual, I'm here to just present it and talk about the premises. This actually isn't my favorite version of the moral argument. Personally, and this is my just personal opinion, I find the teleological moral argument that I'll present in another video, which I actually think is kind of my own novel presentation of it, is more compelling to me personally, but obviously Craig's moral argument is very influential to a lot of people, and it's worth talking about. It's slightly different. Craig's version rests pretty much primarily on moral ontology, the existence of morality as opposed to moral epistemology, how we come to know what is right or wrong. But these are two separate issues that kind of deserve their own things. And Craig's version is primarily dealing with ontology, and I'll point that out with what we mean. So the argument goes like this. Premise 1, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist, and the conclusion is, therefore, God exists. Now, this is a valid argument, so if premise 1 and premise 2 are true, then the conclusion logically follows. So if you don't like it, then you're going to have a problem with one of these premises. Now, let's look at premise 1. Premise 1 is talking about objective moral values and duties, and what we mean by objective is it's something that's mind independent, or at least human mind independent. Objective is basically like an object that exists in the world. Subjective depends on the person's subjective experience, hence the mind dependence. And what this is trying to do is basically argue that when we talk about objective moral values and duties, is it doesn't depend on the people that think it. It's basically, there are some things that are right or wrong. Even if everybody thought something was wrong, it could still be right. Or even if everybody thought something that was right, could still be wrong in a certain case. So the example, for instance, that people will give is like, suppose the Nazis won World War II and ended up creating a Nazi world government and everyone came to believe in Nazism. Would this still be wrong even if necessarily nobody or just one or two people believed in this sort of thing? So that's what we mean by objective moral values and duties. And then premise 2 is basically saying objective moral values and duties do exist, and the way that people will defend this is trying to find, really heinous crimes and try to argue, is it really the case that this is your subjective personal opinion, that you don't like it? Like emotivism or non-cognitivism, these types of words, or is it the case that some things are actually wrong, like things like slavery or rape or violations of, genocide, these sorts of things? Are these really your personal preference to say you just don't like them, or is it the case that these things really are wrong, that there really are things you ought not to do and certain obligations that you ought to do? Now, what Craig finds interesting is he thought most people would actually have a problem with premise 2, most skeptics and atheists. And he found that actually most don't have a problem with premise 2, and as a result, it's premise 1 that they tend to argue against. And I'm both surprised, but also not too surprised, because, Craig, in a lot of philosophical circles, it's more likely you're going to find a philosopher who is fine with rejecting premise 2. There are a lot more philosophers who are moral anti-realists than versus the general population. And as a result, I think, if you're in philosophical circles, you're more likely to find somebody who is a moral nihilist and would doubt premise 2. But when you're talking to people in the general public, I think most people will actually accept premise 2 for the most part. Now, whether that gives people good reason for thinking this or not, that's another issue entirely. But just one thing to keep in mind. Now, one thing to note about premise 1 is written in the contrapositive form. So the contrapositive is basically, if I have a statement like A implies B, the contrapositive is basically saying not B implies not A. And I actually like this version because the normal version of premise 1 would basically say, if objective moral values and duties exist, then God exists. But by saying if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist, you're kind of turning it around and saying, what are your reasons for not believing in God? And do these reasons also apply to your reasons for believing in objective moral values and duties? And this is why, to many theists, it looks like special pleading when somebody says, I don't believe in God because of a lack of objective evidence, or, there's no physical evidence or no scientific test I can do. And then the theist is going to say, okay, but if you believe in objective moral values and duties, how did you come to know these things? Did you do some scientific experiment? Like, what's your epistemology in this particular case? Even though this is regarding more the ontology of the grounding of objective moral values and duties, is kind of calls to attention to the fact that if you're rejecting God but accepting objective moral values and duties, how do you do this without it looking like special pleading or something like this? So that's, I think, the reason that this version of the argument is effective. You could, of course, just maybe in a more simplified way, say if objective moral values and duties exist, then God exists. But this is really calling to attention to the fact that God is considered to be the grounding for these objective moral values and duties, or perhaps you could do an argument to the best explanation. So that's one way you could do it, God being the best explanation for the existence of objective moral values and duties. That's another way, but that would be a slightly weaker version, saying objective moral values and duties do exist, God is the best explanation for the existence of objective moral values and duties, and therefore it is most likely the case that God exists, something like that. And then here's a quote from Paul Kurtz. He's considered the father of secular humanism, and he says, the central question about moral and ethical principles concerns their ontological foundation. That is to say, basically their foundation in reality. If they are neither derived from God nor anchored in some transcendent ground, are they purely ephemeral? So that's, an interesting way to state this idea of the moral argument. Once again, Craig's version is resting on the fact that, hey, look, we all believe that certain things are right or wrong independent of what we think about them. What is the best explanation for these things? To Craig, this would be the existence of God as the best explanation. So that's the argument. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.